Welcome to our new episode of podcast. Today, my guest speaker is Professor James Galbraith. Galbraith holds the Lord Benson Chair and the professorship in the University of Texas. Professor chaired at the Board of Economists for Peace and Security for a very long time, and he directs the University of Texas Inequality project as well. Welcome, Professor James Galbraith, to our show. Formally, good morning, actually.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Professor, let's start from the very personal question. Can you share with me some things about your education as an economist? I mean, why are you an economist? Were you influenced by the fact that your father happened to have been one of the most renowned economists of the 20th century, or something else excited you about the subject of economics?
At the time, I think it led me to believe that the subject was much more interesting and useful than I've later discovered it to be. But then, youth is a time for this kind of foolish belief. And then there were some practical considerations. This was the moment of the Vietnam War, and I spent that part of my youth as an anti-war organizer, political person. And by the time the war ended, there weren't an awful lot of things that I could actually master. And economics was one of these topics where I felt, I could do something. And also was very interested in policy and playing a policy role. And at that time, and to some degree still, but much more then, the degree in economics had a certain prestige value, it gave you a certain entree into policy circles that, other subjects simply didn't carry. So it seemed like a practical route to do what I ended up doing, which was going to work for the U.S. Congress and ultimately running the staff of the Joint Economic Committee for 4 years. And after that, I became an academic. So then I became interested in some of the more abstract issues, and that's carried me for quite some time.
As I know that your research seemed to be broadly within the post-Keynesian analytical frameworks. Can you explain what distinguishes the post-Keynesian economics from the mainstream neoclassical economics? I mean, why do you consider this framework to be superior foundation relative to the mainstream neoclassical economics, both in the journal form or both in your primary area of research in the macroeconomics, the income inequality?
I consider myself to be a little old to be a true post-Keynesian, or perhaps I started a little young. In any event, I got my feet wet as in terms of exposure to a theoretical background when I went to the University of Cambridge in 1974. And there I had considerable exposure to the remaining members of Keynes's original circle, who were not post-Keynesians in any sense, but Keynesians. They were followers and colleagues of John Maynard Keynes. So that was true of Nicholas Calder, for example, and Joan Robinson, and there were several others who were still around. Kahn was still there. And many people who were close to them, like Luigi Pazzanetti, who was still active at the age of 90. So these were people who had a deep influence on the way to think about things. And they understood right from the beginning that the neoclassical tradition, which at that point was asserting its dominance in economics, was not a useful way to think about the problems of the world. Why? Because it was rooted in what is essentially a pre-scientific set of ideas. It's rooted in this 18th century idealism, deism, if you like. It's almost an intelligence design view of the world. It's actually, which itself is rooted, if you like, if you trace it right back into classical Chinese philosophy. I mean, it's just celestial harmony under the imperial rule, which was very suited to 18th century France before the revolution, when these ideas were developed by the physiocrats. Anyway, that's the origin of it, and its whole notion of equilibrium, general equilibrium, and the balance of forces of supply and demand, and so forth, is all based upon these ideas, which are essentially predate the emergence of the modern scientific worldview, of the evolutionary worldview in the mid-19th century. It's associated with Darwin, it's associated with Marx, And it was essentially the worldview that was certainly framed Keynes's thinking. So from that point of view, and from the point of view of my father's own work and the work of his colleagues who actually built an economy in the Depression and in the Second World War and in its aftermath, the neoclassical tradition is simply a bit of academic folderol. It never carried any interest for me. Whereas, if you're working with people who actually combined both a scientific perspective, a lot of practical knowledge and experience, and a record of having intervened effectively and done things, built countries, built economies. And by the way, it's simply true also in what we rather condescendingly call the developing world, and I like that phrase. But they're people who actually did good work, and those are the people I always was attracted to.
Professor Thomas Piketty's work is very famous in our institution. In the PIDE, in PIDE, we discuss a lot. His book, The Capital in the 20th Century, that it caught a huge attention both on the political and economic fronts. But you presented some critical analysis about the Piketty's economic analysis regarding the capital in the age of this globalization. And similarly, some of your students, the Noah Wright also published a very good paper about some data inconsistencies of the Piketty's work. My question is that, can you please educate us a bit on this? Because the Piketty's work, that as I told you earlier, that his work is very famous in our institution.
Thomas Piketty has attempted, I think, to merge a number of incompatible theoretical frameworks. He's very uncomfortable with the neoclassical framework, but nevertheless he uses it. And the result is that he has a very simple view of what drives inequality in the world, and it's encapsulated in this famous inequality between the interest rate and the growth rate, R greater than G, and inequality goes up. And the idea is there's this class of people who are who have capital and who are essentially getting a higher return than the growth rate of the economy, so they're accumulating more resources. Well, and he tries to show that this was a pattern to which the world has returned after a brief interlude in the 20th century, and it's simply not the case. And that's what Noah Wright was actually just a master student of mine, and did a paper for a course. He said, well, let's look at these numbers, and everybody looks at the graphs in Piketty's book and nods and moves on. And Noah actually looked at them and noticed that the timescales were very distorted, that they were stretched and compacted on the horizontal axis of the diagrams in such a way that certain periods got much more emphasis than others. That was the first point. So the first thing to do was to fix that and give everybody every timescale an equal width. And at that point, the patterns become much less clear. And the other thing that Piketty did was, where he didn't have data, he simply made it up, which I think is a fairly serious problem. There was data for the first 1,500 years from year zero that he reports for, which is no information at all. He's just simply he simply plots it, and then so things start being useful maybe around 1,700 or so, and then when the numbers don't revert to the pre-20th century pattern, he simply puts down points for years like 2100 and 2200 AD of the Christian era, for which I'm unaware of a data source that can tell you what happened in the year 2200 or even 2100, although it's only 80 years from now. But if there's an archive in which that data is stored, I don't have access to it. So, this, and he doesn't, it's not marked as projections or is there any authority behind it. He simply plots the number that he wants to make the diagram look to the eye of the unskeptical reader to support his thesis. But strip out those fake numbers essentially, and the data do not show that the 21st century is like the 19th, and they can't. When the 21st century in the advanced countries, we have progressive taxes, we have Social Security, we have unemployment insurance, we have we have all kinds of things which are in fact not like the time of Charles Dickens and Jane Austen and the sources that Piketty refers to as describing the 19th century. We have lots of inequality. There's no doubt about that, and it's a problem. There's no doubt about that. But the 20th century did create modern institutions, and they haven't entirely disappeared.
Professor Asad Zaman, he believes that the MMT is the solution to the problems of Pakistan. And now, what are the problems of Pakistan? Pakistan really faces an economic meltdown. For example, the inflation is running about 11%. The currency has been devalued, and still the local currency is under pressure. The fiscal deficit is very high. The foreign exchange reserves are depleting. The debts are at the unsustainable levels, and the country needs IMF support for the short-term corrections of the balance of payments. And there are many other problems. Now, my question is that what is your sense? Still the MMT can help the country? If yes, how? If not, why?
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, as a point of principle, I avoid giving practical advice to countries that I'm not fully familiar with. The last time I was in Pakistan was in 1961. So I say that my knowledge is not as up to date as it should be. So I know it's unusual for economists to hop off the airplane and say this is what you should do, but I want to be very clear that I want to get in that position. Secondly, with respect to MMT is another movement which is post-Keynesian and it's a very I think remarkable group of people who have clarified their ideas and expressed them in a way which is intuitively sensible and reaches out to a lot of people. So they have mounted what is effectively a very serious challenge to the neoclassical orthodoxy, which is fun to watch because the people who control academic curricula are desperately not anxious to have to confront this. I'm very sympathetic. I don't claim myself to be have made any significant contribution because I'm again of an older generation. But what MMT is not a formula for doing things. It has some useful implications in particularly for countries that have what we call monetary sovereignty. There's to say countries that can get away with things that lots of other countries cannot get away with necessarily. But it's a description of how financial markets actually work. And it's driven by people who really do understand the way in which monetary policy is conducted in a country like the United States. So this is a sort of understanding, among other things, that what gives value to money is the fact that it's accepted as taxes. That a government does not need to collect money from the population in order to spend it, because it essentially brings money into existence by writing checks. Now, that does not mean that a country isn't subject to external constraints. And this is the problem that you were describing, which is that you have an external debt, you have presumably a current account deficit, and you have therefore you have bills that you need to buy. You need to buy energy. You need to buy other things, and unfortunately, the national currency is not going to take you very far. You need to have export earnings or loans in order to do that. I'm inclined. I mean, I think those constraints need to be taken seriously, and so one has to look for ways to do things that relieve those constraints. There's a body of work associated with another friend of mine who was a former finance minister of Brazil, Luis Carlos Brescia Pereira, which he calls New Developmentalism, and it's born out of the experience in Latin America that I think is very relevant, which basically argues that, well, trade is a good thing because you can absorb technologies that were originated elsewhere, and you can make use of them. That finance needs to be kept under control. That this is the essential thing: is that one needs to stay out of a debt trap in order so that you're not constantly draining your national resources in order to pay off past debts, because past debts tend to have been a very bad bargain by and large, particularly if they were incurred for purposes that didn't pan out as having important developmental benefits. Of armaments purchases, for example, are a notorious example of that. So in terms of where resources are going to come from, there are strategic alliances that will bring them, and that's a decision each country needs to make. But I am well aware that let's say one of your neighbors has some interest in making investments, which can be highly beneficial, and so long as those are done on financial terms which are tolerable, and that are favorable, then this is a kind of situation which generates, say, mutual benefit and should be pursued.
Let's suppose that MMT can do something positive. Then who is afraid of MMT? Basically, I'm referring to one of your.
The neoclassical orthodoxy is afraid of it because the alternative position, which is obsessed about debt burdens, internal debt burdens, and budget deficits, is what it serves as a kind of no, we can't go there philosophy for any program of internal reconstruction in particularly in the United States. So with very moderate proposals made by the Biden administration, the so-called Build Back Better, or effectively it will say, no, we're going to have terrible problems because of the budget deficits that are going to be run. Or they look at projections for rising interest rates and say, well, we can't have the Social Security programs we presently have. And this is all, I think, special pleading on the part of the interests that back classical economics, which are obviously the interests of the wealthy. There's a clear political and class issue associated here. But what they're really nervous about, I mean, if you talk about the academics, you poke them a little bit, they're really nervous about that their students are going to start reading this material and ask questions about it in class that they can't answer. Ask for readings, which they don't want to give, or heaven forfend, actually hire people to teach who understand these issues, which would undermine the whole control over the little domains that academic economists really care about, which is who gets hired in their own departments. So, new thoughts are very dangerous to economists. They threaten the most important thing, which is whether you can control the hiring slots in your own department.
So, in continuation, what is your sense about the direction of economics in the years ahead? Now, specifically, will the neoclassical thinking continue to dominate economics, or will the MMT or the PostKeynesian lead?
Well, I think that there's no plausible way that the stranglehold of mainstream orthodoxy on academic economics will be broken. So the best result would be to simply drain resources that go to those people. They're not particularly useful, and let them wither on the vine. If I were an academic administrator, I would say, well, can I put resources into some other departments, public policy, sociology, social economics. I can create branches that will be more that will develop a sort of an evolutionary approach and give some other people with different ideas some control over. And then I think the competition would be much more fair. So that's how I see the progress being made, if there's any way that progress can be made. If there's an institute, and also outside of the hierarchy, the established hierarchy of academic economics. So you mentioned that you have interesting people in your institute. Well, this is very good. I mean, that's a two-way flow here. This is and I mentioned my friends in Brazil, which have there's a lot of flourishing of ideas once one gets away from the dominant positions in the academic sphere in the United States and the UK and continental Europe, and even in the US, where you'll find interesting people is out in the liberal arts colleges and the state universities. There's potential for ideas. One has to build networks in which those ideas can be exchanged and flourish, and then you look for chances to put things into effect. So I'm not entirely fatalistic about the way things go, but I think one just has to recognize that there's dead wood out there, and the dead wood has control of some of the wealthiest and most prominent positions. But okay, that's not the first time that's happened. One has to just present one's case and work toward change.
Now, let's come to COVID. How do you evaluate the ways different countries or regions have responded to the COVID crisis, both in terms of public health intervention and economic policies? Your thoughts?
Well, I did some work on this with my students actually over the last couple of years, and so we looked into this, as things were developing, and I think a fair way of saying it is that the world divided it broadly into two camps. There was a camp that was able to mobilize its population and suppress the virus and hold the line and then recover quite quickly. And that was, of course, the most extraordinary cases is China, but it's also true of Vietnam. It's also true of New Zealand. It was true for a while of a few countries in Europe. It was true of Slovakia, for example. It was true on Taiwan. It was true in Hong Kong, and one can go down a list. It was not an impossible thing to do if you had the experience with the outbreak of epidemics and infectious diseases, if you move very quickly, and if you had the ability to have the cooperation of your population, right, which was the essential thing. It was the mobilization that was the essential thing. This was not true in the wealthier countries. It was not true in the larger countries. It wasn't true in the US. It wasn't true in the UK. It was a little bit more true in Germany, less true in France. Italy is a mixed case. One can go down, again, the list. But what was the characteristic of those countries is very large, decentralized, politically polarized, and also with no capacity to really effectively break the chain of transmission. You can't stop people from crossing state borders in the United States. Australia did. Australia stopped people from moving from Western Australia to New South Wales. It can't go. But that you can't stop people from moving from New York to New Jersey, or even from Texas to Massachusetts. These are entirely open. So this was it's a feature of the societies that they simply suffered a great deal more, and then on the other hand, on the bright side for them, there were certain of the most technically adept societies or scientific establishments were able to roll out vaccines faster. And that was true in the US, and that was true in the UK. It was true of Russia. So one has one had that sort of weighing in the balance as well. It's a somewhat complex picture, I think, but I think they get back to the economics of it. That what was really central was whether one had the capacity to maintain social discipline, maintain supply chains, and that meant that it was a terrific advantage if you were producing these in the mid-range of consumer goods. So you were producing medical equipment, or if you were producing protective equipment, you had a terrific advantage. And so what happened in China was remarkable. In February of 2020, they were producing, I think it was 10 to 15 million face masks every day. By the end of 3 weeks, it was up to 115 million. So everybody who was making any kind of paper product, any kind of, all kinds of things that are diapers and so forth, they all converted to face masks. And they did so very, very fast. And as a result, the shortage, that situation, which was immediately apparent, was over in a very short period of time, and then they were exporting to the rest of the world to the extent they could. So that didn't happen. Still hasn't happened in the United States. That's I think a legacy of the fact that we deindustrialized in this area, and so the U.S. is strong in advanced scientific sectors. It obviously is financially a financial center. But the manufacturing centers that were the prime feature of the U.S. economy 50, 60, 70 years ago in my father's time, they're no longer there. They've moved. And that we really saw the consequences of that over the last couple of years.
In this way, does the experience of the COVID crisis shed any light on the way you think about the economics as a discipline? Or more specifically, the question you might be pursuing in your own research, inequality. Look in this way, after the economic recoveries, the recoveries are very divergent. The rich and the developing countries are recovering much faster than the poor and developing countries. Do you think that these divergent recoveries further widen the rich-poor gap?
Well, I think what strikes me, and it develops out of a kind of convergence between these events and my own earlier work, is that what it tells me is that you have to think about economics as the economy as something that is fundamentally operates on the global scale, through global transmission mechanisms, so that in understanding what happened in the countries of Europe and North America as opposed to the countries of East Asia, their place in the structure of the world economy is the fundamental thing. And I have to say, I have not really come to grips with, and I don't think I understand what's happened in let's say, in sub-Saharan Africa very well. But those are issues one can develop over time. But just taking these cases, which comport most of the production of the world economy, the integration and division of labor between the West and the East, if you like, conveys certain differences in capacity and responsiveness to a crisis of this kind. And this is very sympathetic to the approach I've taken for years to the problem of economic inequality. My view is that precisely we're trained to think about this in national terms. Why is that? Because our universities, your institute, are created. They're creatures of a national setting, and they respond to policymakers who are at the national level. And also, very importantly, our statistical services are all national by and large, with some exceptions, but they're primarily, that's where you get your data. So your data is about Pakistan. And so, but in order to understand what's happening in the world, one has to integrate all of this. One has to put it all into one picture. And then you can say, for example, in our inequality work, what we showed is that the movement of inequality all over the world, and with very limited exceptions of countries that really had isolated themselves, which was true of Iran after the revolution, it was true of China, it was true of India up until 1992 under relatively strict capital controls and so forth. With limited exceptions, there was a common movement of inequality. And why was that? Because the countries that were integrated into the global financial system were all hit by the same crises. They were hit by the debt crisis in the early 1980s. They were hit in the Soviet sphere by the collapse of socialism in the late 1980s. And in Asia through the 1990s, leading up to the crisis in 1997. And you can see this very clearly in the data. And you say, okay, what's going on here is not something which is specific to the Republic of Korea or specific to we can go down the list to Egypt or Tanzania or any place in Latin America. But the common result of the change in the global financial order, 1971, 1981, 1989, 1997. And those things are driven out of the financial centers, out of New York and London, ultimately, of course, Washington. So that understanding that then says, okay, what does our policy? What policies do we need to pursue? Well, the answer to that is that if you're a large country, you have the capacity to take control of your own fate. If you're a smaller country or in a competitive situation with a lot of other small countries, which is true across South Asia, for example, or Latin America, then you have to band together, and you have to have some regional system that will protect you from what is essentially predatory practice. And that predatory practice, you mentioned the IMF earlier, but the IMF is certainly, it's an enforcement agency for the world's creditors. The World Bank, unfortunately, also has taken on that role. The institutions which are, you get development when you have institutions which are dedicated to it. I mean, that's a simple point.
Yes, agreed. Very recently, you wrote a paper. The title of the paper is "The Political Economy of Apocalypse." You wrote that the world faces four great threats: the pestilence, the war, the famine, and the deaths. What do you think about what economic policy choices are available in the near or the distant future, keeping these in view?
These are the four classic horsemen of the apocalypse, so I just used them as a framing for this particular paper. I'm glad you noticed it. I appreciate
very
that.
Great paper. Yes.
It does provide a way of thinking about the most serious problems, and the first one I take up is war. Military spending, the dominance of conflict. This is first of all, it's a big danger. But secondly, the realization for a country like the United States that we need to have is that we're no longer in the era that we thought we were in 1945 or even up into the 60s and so forth. You can have the most wonderfully financed and equipped military in the world, and all the advantages are on the side of the other side. That's what we learned in Iraq. That's what we should have learned from the experience in Afghanistan. The technology, the legal situation, the moral situation, everything is very different from what it was 150 years ago. There's no way in which a neocolonial enterprise of this kind is going to succeed in the long run. So recognize that, and it seems to me that one can come to grips with it, and one has to then deal with the residual bureaucracies and institutions that kind of perpetuate the system, which are a huge drain on resources. And we spend almost $800 billion a year on military military expenditures, and the return for it is essentially it's certainly, I mean, in very crude terms, diminished enormously. It may well be negative. That we absolutely need those resources to deal with the other two, sort of concrete questions. One of which is climate change, which is what I call, I use famine as a stand-in for climate change. But you have to make major investments to, first of all, prevent the worst from happening, and secondly, mitigate what is already baked in the cake and going to happen. And those require real resources, which are directly drawn away from the kinds of things that you spend in the armament sector. And then the other one is pestilence, which is, of course, the pandemic. And that's really a question, as I said, we discussed earlier, of how one gets socially organized to deal with this kind of threat in a way which makes life so that we're not constantly essentially suffering huge human losses, but also a huge disruption. And there, I think also I would take up something, if I were rewriting that paper, and I'm inclined to now to take it up and perhaps expand it. We look at the global supply chain, and we discover that the pandemic really has disrupted things in ways which are much more profound. This is not a fluid situation. It is a very fragile situation, and one in which there's potential for cascading failures. Right now, one that I think must make concern to everybody is that the pandemic is disrupting the flow of fertilizers. The flow of fertilizers, and maybe also the flow of seeds in global commerce. Well, those things run on a schedule. You have to plant when you have to plant, and if you don't have the resources, you're going to end up with food shortages, and those will cascade. I mean, so things stretch out over time in ways which we they're not adequately focused on at the moment. So those three, we have war, pestilence, and famine, cover the territory. The fourth horseman is, of course, death himself, and that is we see that as a psychological question, as a question of despair, a question of the kinds of things that are producing what in this country is an epidemic of opioids and other. The situation becomes unmanageable. A lot of people do have a tendency just to give up, and that's again a sign of that. It's a symptom of the trouble that we're in.
Your father wrote very phenomenal pieces, but two very great books are there. One is The Affluent Society, and the other one is The New Industrial State. I read these books because that was the part of our coursework when I was in Masters of Economics. Now, my question is this: if you were to rewrite these books today, what important development might they describe, and what might their title be?
This is a delicate question.
Thank you.
Late in his life, my father would summon me to his bedroom and say, "It's time you wrote a really important book." And I was going, "Yes, Dad. Thank you, Dad." It's not easy necessarily having a father of that particular stature. On the other hand, the Affluent Society is dedicated in part to me and to my brother Peter. That's something which one carries with one in life, and I have made a real effort over the years to, particularly since my parents passed, to act as a kind of custodian for my father's legacy and make sure that his books stay in print and that they continue to be accessible. And I have written a little bit. I did a preface for the edition of the New Industrial State that kind of talked about the changes that occurred. The New Industrial State was written at a time when the great industrial corporation was an American corporation. It's a little bit presumptuous, but I'm inclined to refer to the Galbraithian states. Post-war Germany is an example. post-war Japan is a very strong example. In Germany, it was my father had a direct role. He was one of the first people to recommend the Marshall Plan, and he actually drafted a speech for the Secretary of State in 1946 that set the path for West German self-government. In Japan, close associate Shigeru Tsuru played an important role in the design of the post-war Japanese economy.
Thank you, Professor. I'm taking your too much time. Just one last.
No, not at all. Go ahead. This is great fun. This is great fun. I really enjoy it.
What do you think that what is going to take for someone, either on individual level or for an institution, to really do something about closing the rich-poor gap? Because this is your area of research, inequality, I think.
It's a sort of one thing. In the world that we're moving into, the crucial thing is to create a system in which the broad population has a decent life. This is what my friends in Ecuador are called. I think they coined the phrase "buen vivir," or good living. To say, or to take the phrase current in China, shared prosperity, modest prosperity. This is what we're looking, what we need to achieve, and that requires that you approach it very conscientiously, but also in a way in which the broad population has access to goods that are shared in common, to open spaces, to clean air and water, to culture, to the whole range of things that make life interesting and agreeable, to housing, and these things have to be planned out and provided. So the idea that you can do this simply by a process that's highly decentralized, that's highly oriented toward personal consumption, is one which is going to be, I think, quite specific to the century that's passed, and will not be the successful model of the century that we're now living in. Because we're living under more strict constraints. There's more competition for resources, and so we have to be more conscious about how to use them. That's not a direct answer about how an individual or an institution. I'm inclined to think that this is, that in the world in which we live, large countries, and your country is a large country, that this is a question that has to be dealt with at the level of the national government. But it is also one that requires a certain degree of autonomy from forces that are intrinsically destabilizing: financial, military, environmental.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very wonderful talk. Very wonderful talk. Thank you.
I appreciate it. It's great fun.
I will definitely invite you once again for a class lecture or for a webinar, because this is a very great talk, and you are really a very, very pleasant person. I thank you very much.
It's very kind of you. Very good to be with you. It's very nice to have an exchange with a fellow person with whom I have a lot of common feeling.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, viewer. We will. This is end from our side. We will meet you in the next episode in the next week with a very good topic and with a very good speaker once again. Till then, bye bye.